afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us to this communications roundtable, which is probably the forgotten topic in this event. And we have some speakers, well, simply wonderful. And because they have accumulated so much experience in how to understand and transform the information so it can be reached by citizens in the easiest way. So we have journalists joining us, as well as researchers. So I will just now introduce them so you can see the great group of specialists we have here. I am Íñigo, as you know, and then we have Sara Güemes. Sara Güemes is an environmental communicator, and she's also a consultant at the LIBERA project. Then Sara works to make us understand the importance of environment and how to get rid of waste and how to manage waste properly. She has been working on this topic all her life. Nicolas Vicente, on her right-hand side, is a journalist from the Spanish national television, and he's very familiar with media. He's worked for La SER, La Razón, Onda Cero, the EFE agency, and in other important publications such as Terra, the Eurosport, and among others. So the professionals joining us here today work in different areas, including social networks and written press and television. And then we have Nicolas with more than, Javier Salas, with more than 15 years of experience specialized in technology. Since 2014, he has been working for Materia, which is the area specialized on technology for ICE, informing us where the world is heading to. Then he has been awarded with the Ortega Gazette Award, which is not a minor prize. He has worked also for the news services in Telecinco, and he was also part of the public entities. And lastly, we have Laura Afonso from Canaria Radio. She's specialized in environmental topics. And it is very interesting listening to her because she brings common problems that sometimes are difficult to explain, I would say, to the general public, to the audience in general. She's also a TV anchor, and she has also written a book that is called Blue, Yellow, and Green, an introduction to save the world. It's a very interesting book, but it's important also to understand when it is being said when it comes to recycling and preservation. Sara has to leave at 10 to 4, so please don't think that she's being rude. She just needs to leave before the end of the session. So I'm going to start with her with a very brief question. And then when we start working with, or we start asking more general questions, please talk to her first because she needs to leave. So let's start. Sara, you're working at the LIBERA project. How can you explain, how do you all explain people in a easy way the mechanism you found to convey the idea of the message you wanted to send to all interested parties? Good afternoon. Yes, and I would like to apologize for leaving earlier. LIBERA is generated from Sea Over Lives in collaboration with Ecoembe 6 years ago. And in May 2017, when we started working on what we built on a scientific basis and with the support of citizens, we found a first stop. That was that people were not aware that there was a problem. So most of you are aware of that problem, but the remaining 46.9 million remaining inhabitants in Spain when we asked them through some sociological studies, a very little proportion of society were aware of what littering meant. So 6 months later or 8 months later, after creating LIBERA, and once we got the first researchers tackling this littering problem, we realized that we couldn't move forward if we don't tell Paco, Maria, or Juan, who are just lying on the sofa watching telly, or telling Estíbaliz, Maria, or Petra, who are part of university, if we don't show them that littering is a real problem, and it is not just something ugly in the environment, but something that is polluting and killing species, then we need to create a term. And that was, and I'm really convinced about this, that was our success, if we can talk about success in this topic. And the word was literature. Something like this. It's a combination of litter and nature. So everyone could understand this, and everyone understands this. If we tell you this term, if I tell you litter, neuter, or people understand perfectly. Literature. But not only Pepa and Maria and John knows that, but the rest of media are also working with us on this, because we have all together explained what the problem means. And we did believe that it was necessary to have a term to define the problem, because if there is not a term, the problem doesn't exist. So we started very shyly spreading the term and explaining what the problem was, and we did it very steadily, and now in a curve that is quite similar to the one of climate change, unfortunately, has been growing up in positive terms, because the more people who know or are aware of this problem, this creates a stronger base, so everyone understands or recognizes the needs for a solution. So last year, just to give you some details, this word was used in the whole Spanish-speaking community across the world, including South America, Central America, and other Spanish-speaking communities in North America or Asia. This term was used more than 20,000 people. Well, it may look like not a big number, but in communication terms, I hope you all agree on this, because it's a big number, because we're talking about Maria, Juan, and Antonio, and we're starting a process. And as I said, this term was also mentioned by the media, and that was mentioned more than 4,000 times only in Spain. And this is incredible, because this also allows us to spread our message. Antonio Muñoz Molina, who is an academist from the Royal Spanish Academy, want this term to be introduced within the dictionary, the official dictionary for Spanish. Maybe this will come in the future. This term, literature, will maybe, when this is included in the dictionary, the level of literature or litter in the nature has been reduced. This, as you may know, we work not only in the marine sector, but we also work, as we have been seeing different projects presented in these different roundtables, we work in the environments of continental waters or land areas, because we need to raise awareness in villages, in inland villages like Madrid or Guadalajara, so we all know that this is not just a static problem, but it's also a polluting problem. And this allowed us, and I will answer your question now, that the term literature has served as a flag for representing the solutions we are suggesting or proposing from the scientific point of view. We're also working with city councils, with companies, with students, with small associations, that are spread around Spain. We're also working with national and local natural parks. And last year we we mobilized more than 30,000 people, and we characterized more than 280 types of waste. This is the result of working one by one citizens to use the tools they have at their disposal. So once they go to the nature to collect litter, they know what they are collecting, and to tell their fellow citizens and their workmates and their friends what they are doing and how they are doing that. And this has been also supported by the action of media. We have felt that they have been supporting us, and I do hope that literature, which is not included in the official dictionary, will appear in this publication soon. This is an example of how organizations are looking for solutions to convey messages. And this leads us to the second part. We're talking now to Nicolas. Of course, the rest of you can contribute or can give your opinion. How do you tackle environmental issues from the Spanish national television? I would like to play two videos from last weekend. One of them is about the UN treaty, and the other one is about a video created by a private company that is, promoting an environmental project about their environmental commitment. I want Alex back in the room to show how important it is to show the importance of images. This image you can see here, which you have probably seen several times, says a lot. Maybe the photographer thought he made a mistake. He wanted to make a picture of a seahorse, but he didn't realize that finally he created an icon. So maybe we all remember this picture of this little Ilan who died on the Greek shore after coming on a dingy boat from Syria. But as you can see, pictures are consumed very quickly, and that's something that we mentioned during the coffee break. Sometimes for instance, the pictures appearing on tobacco packages, people don't pay much attention to them. At the beginning, they were pretty shocking. So from media, we have to pay much attention to these, and we have to bear in mind the effect those images have on people. So last Sunday in the news program, we decided to talk about a difficult treaty. It's a treaty that cannot be expressed in images, and we all thought if Maria, Petra, Luis would be interested in listening to a topic that sounds so far away, such as the high waters treaty, and transferring that much amount of information in a news program is very, very difficult, because sometimes we only retain one or two main ideas. So that's why we try to convey messages in a very direct way. That's why they are becoming so superficial. So that's why we decided to create a clickbait. And we created some images that were used. We used images of sea litter. So let's see now how this was shown on the news. Alex, please.
Y esto es otra cosa que también suele pasar mucho en televisión, que el vídeo no entra.
This is something that usually happens on television. We have technical problems. So, Alex, now it's your fault, apparently. And while you are trying to fix the problem, we are going to continue speaking. So, we are going to speak about the concurrence of people filming with their own or shooting with their own phone. So and sometimes this message is sent in a different way, because when we get the news on our phones, that makes us part of the whole process. So now we're going to watch the video now. This is the clickbait.
Una buena noticia para los océanos. Después de años de debate, anoche los países de la ONU alcanzaron un acuerdo histórico para proteger la alta mar en los océanos.
Un acuerdo vital para su conservación y que para el 2030 va a convertir en zona protegida el 30% de los océanos.
Después de 15 años de negociación,
The ship has reached the shore.
el barco ha llegado a la costa. Así lo anunciaba esta madrugada la presidenta de la negociación, Renalí. Se trata de un acuerdo entre los países de la ONU con un nuevo tratado para proteger la alta mar en mares y océanos, una reivindicación histórica de los ecologistas.
Por fin hoy se ha acordado el texto que va a formar la futura Constitución de los Océanos.
Hasta ahora los acuerdos afectaban solo a las 200 millas más cercanas a la costa, es decir, donde cada país tiene competencias. Eso es apenas un 1% de toda la superficie marina. Con este acuerdo, que actuará en la alta mar, se llegaría a proteger el 30% de los océanos en el 2030. A los expertos les preocupa que no se hayan concretado los límites de la explotación del fondo marino.
Esto es vinculante, pero es verdad que es algo vago. Hay muchas actividades humanas, económicas, que podrían beneficiarse de esa diversidad genética.
Las negociaciones concluyeron un día después de la clausura de la conferencia internacional All Ocean. En total, 193 países, incluidos Rusia, China y Estados Unidos, han acordado el tratado, que ahora tiene que ser ratificado por cada uno de los países y aprobado en la Asamblea General de las Naciones Unidas.
Very quickly. Now, here we mixed images from agencies and people, and images taken by people at home. So we need to mix these new languages. This is a very long video for what we usually do at the news programs, because we think that after 20 seconds we need a second stimulus. So, and this is almost a minute long. And now we are, there is now a greater awareness towards environment. And we've seen this at the Spanish television. So the interest in politics has just plummeted. There are many programs that are also seen as a window to these environmental issues, such as Aquí la Tierra, where we can see that people show a greater interest in the environment. And this is something that is understood by brands, because they see that their environmental policy is simply necessary. We have many proposals every day on the table, and we need to analyze which ones deserve a minute of our time. So the next video is a proposal that we understood was necessary because we took a deeper look on this, and we understood that it was an interesting issue. And we try not to say the name of the sponsor or the brand, but in order to make this more attractive, the person who sent this, who is maybe 22, 23, said, okay, we're going to include SpongeBob on this video, and he thought that's going to be your last day here. And then he gave this fresh image of mixing cartoons with real images that made it very interesting.
Internacional tiene este año un particular condimento científico. Les explicamos por qué. Uno de los barcos se va a dedicar a recoger muestras del fondo marino para analizarlo en pro de la ciencia.
Debajo de todo este manto azul hay todavía muchos secretos por descubrir. Se estima que tan solo se ha explorado el 5% de los océanos. Y mientras surca los mares, el equipo Bioterme es segundo en la Ocean Race, pero a la cabeza de la ciencia. Gracias a este microscopio, en cada etapa de las regatas recogen datos sobre la salud de nuestro océano y del fitoplancton.
¿Plancton está vivo? ¡Hurra!
Es muy importante que no muera porque absorbe más del 25% de todo el CO2 producido por el ser humano, clave en la lucha contra el cambio climático.
Estoy vivo. Es genial estar de vuelta.
We have to fight only for people to be able to live on this planet in a good way.
Este barco laboratorio llega a sitios casi inexplorados, por eso la información que recoge es tan valiosa para comprender cómo el océano puede hacer frente al cambio climático.
This is the success of communication campaigns. How do we collaborate with brands, with projects, with communicators? Well, by teaming up. So if we don't guarantee that these actions reach the final audience, it's as if they didn't exist. So thank you very much, Nicolas. I would like to move now to Laura, but maybe I wanted to pass it to Javier, but I think Laura's words will be more in line with Nicolas's. It's because Laura is going to adapt this vision to a more regional perspective, especially focusing on what are the consequences on the territory where we live. So the people where we live in different provinces have an added level of personal detail.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be with my esteemed colleagues. And I was going to start talking about that precisely, actually, because I represent the only independent media source here in the Canary Islands. I created the Onda Cero program because of this specific problem. We wanted to, Hora Cero, sorry, we wanted to create programs specifically addressing the issues concerning climate change, the environment, and marine wastes. Of course, we live on islands that are surrounded by water, and we depend on the state to ensure the health of our seas. In 2019, I had the chance to attend the climate summit in Madrid. It was supposed to be held in Chile, but thankfully, as it was closer to home, I was able to attend. And I wasn't working in that case for Hora Cero. It was another publication in the Canaries. And I'm proud to say that it was the first time that we were able to open newspapers every morning over a week and read news stories about the environment. We were able to, here in the Canary Islands, transfer the news that we were hearing internationally to regional stories. And I'm really happy about the outcome of this. You can see on the screen here, Hora Cero, and the logo. It's a weekly radio show on Mondays, and it lasts around half an hour. It's all we could negotiate, unfortunately, but it's something. In the beginning, it seemed like it was going to be just a hobby, let's say, but now it's turned into something that is a real passion for me, and I think it's really necessary. It's part of a public media network. And I think that for public networks, there really needs to be a part that is dedicated to the environment. And we didn't have that until Hora Cero. We are in our 4th season now. And I think finally, okay, it hasn't been that much time, but actually this week we made our 100th episode. And I think that now people are starting to understand that communicating environmental issues in the Canary Islands is really important, particularly bearing in mind our island nature. What we're working on now is trying to make sure that the big bosses understand that radio is good, but an image speaks 1,000 words. And if we were able to dedicate this space in other types of media as well, we would be able to transmit our message to more people. often we assume that people know what we're talking about, but when you start talking to people, you realize that actually there's very little knowledge about this topic. So we're thinking about putting together a set of guidelines for advice for your average Joe. We created this, I wrote this book, Green, Yellow, Blue is the title, but they're all mixed up on the cover page. And the idea is it's a guide to how to save the planet. The goal was to speak in layman's terms, to talk to those people that really don't know where to start. My friends and family often ask me for advice. They say that they are worried about the climate crisis, but they really don't know what to do. And I always say, well, it can, start with very small actions. And I always also try to be positive, be optimistic, and rather than putting my hands on my head and saying, oh my God, the world is going to end. Well, really, it's much more positive if we can give people some hope. And that's the goal of this book. So I would love for us to be able to update this book, because the pace at which climate change is progressing means that data becomes outdated very quickly. Javier, 15 years ago, before you started working in media, you were a reader of media, I suppose. So how has media changed over this time? Well, for me, to create new terms like basuraleza and to encourage politicians to do something, we need to, first of all, present what the problem is. The last piece of news that I wrote about in El Repúblico was a report based on a personal experience. I went on an ocean voyage with a Spanish crew to investigate the oceans. And what really hit home during that trip, well, at that time, there was a lot of talk about this big plastic island in the middle of the ocean, and people were wondering just how big it was. Well, the crew that I traveled with had traveled all around the world, and I was asking them about this. And he said that it's not like an island, you can't stand on it. Actually, it's something that's made up of microplastics. And that was the first time I'd come across that term. So when I came home, I started researching this new topic of microplastics. I found one report written by a British scientist. There were very few actually out there. We still weren't aware that these microplastics were entering into the food chain. But over this time, we have brought together a lot of information. To identify what a problem is, we have to research it. We didn't have much to work with at that time. Now, on this slide, I've displayed a couple of more recent news stories from the past couple of years in El País that demonstrate how now we have a lot more information. We're able to give a lot more detail because we've really investigated this problem in depth. So we both work with, when we work with scientific data, it's important to transmit this to the public. It's important to give information about the causes of each problem and what the results could be. But in order to do this, we need the raw materials, let's say. And this is another food chain, in a way. We were the ones who started all of this, looking for these scientific reports, gathering data, giving specific details, and step by step, we opened up this discourse, explaining in more simple and accessible ways with these new terms that have been invented, giving real-life examples of how people are affected in their day-to-day lives. But first, we have to know what's going on to be able to communicate it effectively. Well, it's really interesting because I suppose there are two sides here. There's the journalist who receives information, has to decide whether or not it's news, and then they have to sell it to the editing board. I'd like to hear about the difficulties in that regard as well. And then there's us who are working in communication, who try to get the attention of these writers for them to write about the topic and translate our findings. So first, I'd like to know if it's easier nowadays to publish stories about science and the environment. And I'd also like to know if the people that give you this information are able to give you all of the information you need. I'd like to know what help you get from the organizations that do this kind of research. And perhaps you can give us some advice on how we can help you further. Well, I'm, I suppose, the person that's trying to give information to these journalists and writers. Well, it's a real challenge because, and I know because I've been on the other side, there's a lot of information and content to choose from. And sometimes you have to say no to 100 different proposals until finally something grabs your attention. A press release is, I suppose, the most basic form of media communication. But the headline of a press release is so important because it gives a sense of whether it's something scientific, in which case I would explain all of the methodology, all of the structure, all of the results. And also what I'm trying to do is make sure that the information that I pass on is relevant and to make clear who it's relevant for. If it's affecting flora, fauna, or a particular space, etc. So for us at LIBERA specifically, or generally speaking, when it comes to communication for all of these projects that are here at this event, I think what's really important is to transmit the sense that what we're telling them through these channels is relevant and important. It may be a local radio station, or it may be a more regional media source, such as the Canary Islands Radio, or it could be a national media. So there's lots that we can communicate, but we need to choose carefully. And we also need to make sure that everything that we communicate has a firm scientific basis. I would underline this word responsibility that you mentioned, because we often have to fight a lot against fake news. Fake news stories in minor media outlets are often much more interesting to the public than the stories that we publish. And it's a real struggle. This new way of publishing news stories through these smaller online outlets are a real problem in this regard. Kremlins are what we call those stories that are really serious and that are worth paying attention to. And Disney stories are what we call stories that grab a lot of attention. And we need to find a combination of these two things, I suppose. This image that I showed you earlier of the seahorse holding the earbud really grabbed attention. But it's doesn't make sense to grab the attention of the public if we haven't got anything real to tell them. I think that it's our responsibility. For instance, we were talking in the break about if we find a shark close to the coastline, we need to know who we need to communicate that to, not just to the person that screams the loudest. What I'm really interested in then is these new forms of communication. I think we're using the television less and less. We use our mobile phones and we share information very quickly with our networks. And this kind of communication must include images. Yes, I have received a lot of help. Well, we were given a slot 12:30 at night in the beginning, and now we're on at 9:30. So it's we're able to attract a wider public at this time. Well, I suppose what happened was that there was a realization that the information was interesting, and so they decided to put you on earlier in the evening. Well, yes, I suppose the information is on Spotify, and so ultimately everyone listens to it when they want to listen to it. It doesn't matter, I suppose, what time we do the live version. People prefer to listen to our content when they are in the mood. But it's true that these media sources are facilitating things for us now. But there's also a big problem with greenwashing. Lots of companies send us emails suggesting topics which may be interesting, but they perhaps don't actually have any substance. And what they're trying to do is use us as a platform to communicate a message that benefits them. So perhaps we need to have a more strict filter to make sure that our program isn't just a way of giving publicity to other companies. The media sources that have a lot of access to data, to open source data, for instance, are able to find out how much time people spend reading particular news articles and what types of news articles they look at. We found that people are a bit tired sometimes of reading too many stories about the environment and climate change. We can see peaks and troughs in people's choices of media. Often if a new film is released or if their friend has recently gone on holiday to Copenhagen, for instance, well, there are specific times when interest increases in specific topics. And knowing this, we can put particular topics on offer and make sure that they've got media stories to choose from. So how do you know if a news story is interesting? What is the media outlet that is most revealing? Is it TikTok or YouTube? Well, I suppose if there's a summit, an environmental summit coming up, then of course we can expect there to be more interest in the topic. Sometimes it happens out of nowhere. What we need to ensure then is that we're always ready. When interest begins to rise in an environmental topic, we need to know what kind of stories are out there. We need to be ready with some good ideas of things to publish. These peaks in interest happen very regularly, and there are often troughs as well. Sometimes an important event has happened and we put it on our platform, but no one clicks on it. on the radio, it's quite difficult to know what topics are of more interest than others. You're never quite sure what type of audience you're going to have for a particular podcast. I can't remember what I was going to say, said the speaker. Well, yes, as you were saying, there are peaks and troughs in interest, so it's important to know where we are. Well, we have a minute-to-minute tool. It helps us to understand how our audience is behaving at any particular time. We have a team of sociologists who help us. We are a public media source, so of course we're not obliged to talk about what people want to hear necessarily. So rather, there are certain things that we have to talk about, even if people aren't interested in it. If there's been a UN agreement or the war in Ukraine, for instance, that does bring our viewer numbers down, but we have to talk about it. We have a very strong team, however, that helps us with this challenge. There are big topics, feminism, refugees, etc., that are receiving a lot of attention because there is so much political discontent at the moment. So if we can encourage people step by step to have more interest in the environment, then we will be able to talk about it even more. With regards to what you were talking about, these peaks in interest, I also think we have to be careful if we don't measure them properly, or if we... Because if we publish too many stories on the topic, then people can become tired of reading about it. People can become anxious about all of the negative stories that they're reading, or perhaps they may start to feel a little indifferent on the problem because they've read too many bad news stories. Yes, I think that a good journalist is able to help people to feel part of the story, to not feel disconnected from it. I think we've observed exactly what you're talking about. We have all these terrible, catastrophic news stories. For instance, we had one story recently that came in about somebody showing their house with their solar panels and their washing machine, etc. It wasn't anything too complex, but it was a very, very popular news story. We've heard about all of the catastrophes, but it was something more practical, just like my colleague's book. It was giving people practical advice, examples of what they can do. Before social media, of course, the mainstream media decided what was interesting and what wasn't. And sometimes the interest groups decided not to publish certain stories simply because they weren't interested in it. But nowadays, there are different influencers, I suppose, who are deciding what are the trending topics. So all of you give stories to media sources, and I would like to advise you not to lie. Don't make the mistake of thinking that they're stupid. Perhaps you may be able to get away with it once, but you won't get away with it twice. So greenwashing, we've talked about a few times, and I want to ask a question about it because it's a fact that private companies will do it. But public greenwashing also exists, and it depends on other factors as well. How do you detect greenwashing, and what can you do about it? And the second question is, which is more important, the media outlet or the news story? Well, I would say that the journalist is the least important. The journalist should never be the most important part of a news story. Maybe I'm a bit old-fashioned, because it's true that nowadays the stars of a news story are the journalists themselves, the ones who are presenting it. But about greenwashing, well, how do we detect it? I suppose if you base all of your news stories on things that arrive in your email inbox, well, you're more likely to fall for it. But I do think it's important to avoid these types of topics. And when it comes to government, they often approach me because they want to talk, for instance, about the climate change law that was passed in 2022. And of course, I have to talk about it. And of course, the regional minister is the one who's going to be talking to you on the phone, on the radio program, and you have to talk to them because they're the key figurehead of this news story. But you don't only have to speak to them. You can also speak to others who are against the law, who oppose it for whatever reason. You can speak to universities. For instance, on the Implamac project in La Laguna, we have addressed lots of different issues which perhaps on occasion are in part greenwashing, and if that is the case, then we try to compensate this by adjusting the news story slightly. Well, I actually think that the journalist is important, because we can't be a pain in the bum. Because when journalists start to, bother people, then it can really disrupt the attention that these articles receive. Some people follow particular journalists because they really enjoy the way they communicate, and they follow them on social media, etc., because of that. But with regards to format, I think a really important thing, even when it comes to greenwashing, is to be aware of the denial that still exists in our national media. I do think that lots of newspapers still deny that climate change is real. Are you talking about lobbying? Well, actually, this has all been studied. Recently, there was a study that identified news stories that deny climate change by presenting specific data, etc. So we need to be aware of which columns do tend to express these kinds of opinions. So opinion columns that say, these aren't on the headlines, these are written by the gentlemen. Actually, no, they're actually mostly written by women. So, well, in the previous decade, what has changed then? In newspapers specifically, is that there's been a lot more attention placed on these opinion pieces specifically. Well, I suppose part of the job of a journalist is to have an opinion. Well, there are lots of different opinions in a media source. There are influencers, there are politicians, etc. But the first thing that I look at actually when I have a news story is who's written it and what source of media it's written in. That is what will determine whether or not I believe it. So in Spain, there are laws governing publicity, and we're not able to actually carry out publicity because we can receive fines. But there was a video once that did publicize a particular company, but we also saw that it gave visibility to a very interesting issue. So I think we have to find a middle ground. We can't close the door on all private initiatives. Well, let's just clarify what greenwashing is. Sometimes there's a bit of a grey line, and other times it's very clear what's happening. Another problem is sensationalist, attention-grabbing media. This is also risky. What we need to do as professionals is to take responsible decisions. And if your readers are disappointed in you once, then they may not give you a second opportunity. I come across this sensationalist type of media a lot because I work regionally, and there are a lot of very general media sources that talk about a bit of everything. And when they talk about the environment, it's usually negative stories. In the next 30 years, the Canary Islands is going to use X number of kilometers of coastline, etc., etc. In general media sources, they're more interested in these types of negative stories. And so we do have to be careful with these sensationalist stories and try to find a balance, let's say. We have 7 minutes left. So I'd like to open the floor to questions. First, the gentleman. Good afternoon. I wanted to ask you about our young generation who probably don't listen to the radio, they probably don't watch the daily news, they probably don't read the newspaper. So how can we reach them? And actually, it's interesting because these are issues that young people are very interested in because they've been born into this climate crisis. How can we reach these young people who watch series on Netflix all day? I know that young people don't read newspapers, buy newspapers. They might come across a news story of mine occasionally on Instagram, for instance, but what I want to try and ensure is that when they do come across these articles on Google, when they bump into them, let's say, that what they're reading is truthful and is quality journalism. So when these young people do reach out and look for information, that they find something decent to read. The more reluctant journalists say that the internet is a bad thing, that they're going to come across more negative and poor content than good. But honestly, if we're not reaching young people, then it's our problem. It's not young people's problem. It's challenging. I think the way we're consuming data as well is in chunks and bits. Also, we are more active rather than passive in our news. When we read news, we go and look for a specific piece of news on the internet. I think we're capable of change. We've already changed because when digital formats of media came about, nobody thought that they would necessarily be as successful as they have been. And actually, I would say that radio is more alive than ever. I hope, in fact, that young people, even if they consume data and news stories in different ways, that they will still be interested. Of course, we're going to have to adapt. The Canary Islands TV and radio network are very aware of that. We need to keep up with the times. Traditional media outlets are very aware that there are more modern ways of consuming the news. And there's a lot of fake news out there too. When I began studying, Twitter came out. And everyone said that it was never going to work because there was a 140-character limit. But nowadays, the government uses Twitter to announce their news stories. Football teams, all kinds of entities do. And so I'm sure in the future people will communicate news in a completely different way to they do now. Unfortunately, we won't have time to talk about how those that are in charge of all these new platforms decide on what news is published on there. But, well, let's move on to the next question. I think you've already answered my question, actually. How does GPT chat affect the way things are communicated? It's a real trending topic now, this new AI tool. I don't know how this information is generated on this platform. Perhaps it's influenced by lobbies, perhaps, how truthful is it? It's very accessible for young people who are looking for specific information in quick internet searches. Well, these online chat bots are a result of what they have input from the internet. And in fact, it learns as more questions are asked of it. This is going to take over all of the conventional search engines because it's much more effective. It's basically encompasses all of the information that is on the internet. That's how it works. And in fact, schools are already trying to incorporate this new technology in the tasks that they ask their students to do because they know that it's inevitable that it's going to be a part of the future of the education curricula. But I would go back to my previous comment that what we need to do is to make sure that when they look for information, it's reliable. Actually, this also a problem, these very specific searches, because we're often presented with news that agrees with our own opinions, but the opinions of people who are really trained and educated in these topics aren't necessarily going to be the results that come up after our search. We'll be presented with articles that have received lots of likes or have been shared many times. And so our responsibility is to publicize those sources that are much more reliable. Well, I would say ChatGPT isn't necessarily used for most more up-to-date news stories because it's only got information up to 2021, and it's not connected to the internet at the moment. And I would like to ask Javier about Generation Z. Of course, as you said, we don't watch the daily news, more serious series tend not to grab our attention, let's say. And Twitch isn't the answer, because even if something is on Twitch or Instagram, I won't necessarily watch it or look at it. If I'm not interested in it, I'm not going to read it no matter what platform it's on. So what do you think is the best way to address this issue, to make what you want to tell these people interesting? How to grab the attention of Generation Z so that it's attractive for them? Lots of people okay, well, this Generation Z actually are the ones who should be answering this question, I would say. What interests you? What do you want to see when you look for news? Well, what I don't want to see is a daily news report on Twitch. So what do you use to find news? Well, I use Twitter, Instagram, different channels. But for instance, what you were saying earlier, you know, asking for a YouTuber to tell me the news. Well, I never learn about environmental news via YouTube. Okay, so what do you read? Well, there are people in the environmental sector that communicate news in a way that I enjoy reading. Their opinions linked to general news stories. But I often end up having a very general overview, and what I really want is more in-depth information. I want them to get down to the nitty-gritty rather than just giving me a general overview. We've got 3 minutes left, so please, just very briefly. The problem with not reading newspapers or proven news outlets is that you don't know if it's trustworthy. So we need to make sure that what we're publishing is trustworthy. COVID was very reflective of this problem. There was so much fake news out there. So we need to win back our credibility after this. Once we've done this, we will still have a lot more things to change. And I'm sure that it's not easy for you to watch a news summary, but you're still learning a lot more about the news than I did at your age, because young people these days consume more information, they're more interactive with information, and so we need to make sure that the information we put out there is reliable. And as I said just before your question, the problem is that people go and look for specific information. And if I want to hear an opinion that's the same as mine, then I'm not necessarily going to be reading the best news stories, because it's not easy to read something that I don't agree with. For instance, the story about the war in Ukraine, a lot of people don't want to read about it, but I think we really need to. Very briefly, I don't have an answer. If I did, I would be absolutely loaded. But I think the most interesting thing is that, yes, okay, you are interested in all of this, but the remaining 90% of people perhaps aren't. And so we really need to focus more on them, because it's true that you are particularly interested in this topic and you've identified the specific sources of information that you enjoy, but everybody else never hears information that they're not already interested in. So what we need to find out is how to get to those people that aren't interested in this. This new generation gets news in new ways, and I don't know how to reach them. And I agree, it's a challenge. We need to adapt to these new generations in terms of this type of information and all information. We need to make sure that news is attractive, and communicating, listening to each other, what we've been doing today is absolutely key. When I was 15, I didn't watch the news. I found out about the news because of my conversations with my friends in the playground. Nowadays, we have mobile phones and we have social media. And I think that a lot of young people lack maturity still. So it's, I suppose, your responsibility, Generation Z, to educate your peers. And in Twitch, there are things happening that old people used to do. It seems like we're maybe going back in time a little bit with what we want from communication as well. Well, thank you very much to all of the speakers. Thank you to the audience. I hope you've got a lot from this session. Key takeaways then. Ways of relating to the media, transparency, trustworthiness. These people here have to sell these news stories. Thank you very much, everybody.